Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our IBD Peer Support Group here at Mount Sinai Hospital, a hybrid meeting. So we have a number of people who have joined online, and there are a number of people who are in the Mount Sinai auditorium as well. So hello to everybody. We're really glad that you could join us today, and back to those who have been with us before. And you know, we're just glad that we can get together, hopefully learn a few things, maybe share some stories, have some laughs, or answer some questions. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the format, generally we have an expert speaker come in and give a presentation for the first bit. And afterwards, there's usually some time left to where we can ask questions and connect with each other. So we're very lucky today. I'd like to introduce Brian Walsh. He is a supervisor, educator, and practice resource at Sinai Health System. He's been a clinician working in spiritual care since 2006, including a decade at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and various acute care settings before that, including general internal medicine. And so I will pass the baton over to you, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. Can everybody online hear me? Yeah? Okay, good stuff. Because I'm just going to cover up the people so that I can just see my slides. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. I know that some of you will be watching this live online, and some folks will be watching it later on recording. Either way, thanks for being here and taking some time to explore this idea. I have to admit, I am not an expert in IBD. I have a lot of experience working in general internal medicine, so there's some crossover, but really my field is spirituality and the ideas of how to make meaning in hard times. And so some of that is super transferable across every illness, and some of it might not be and might be fairly specific. It's quite interesting how we're all so very similar and yet each one so very unique. So what I'd like to do is, there we go. What we're going to do is explore a basic definition of what is spirituality. Then we're going to look at what is spiritual distress and what should we do about that in our own lives. While I go through these three topics, I'd really invite you, for every slide, ask yourself, so what? Why does this matter? Does this have any relevance to my own life? And some of it might, and some of it might not, and that's fine. Take what's useful and leave the rest. If there's a particular word you don't love, I'd invite you not to get hung up on the language. Like some people just don't like the S word at all. Spirituality is a big problem. Existential concern is just too big of a mouthful. So take what's actionable and leave the rest. So what I'd like to start with is just looking at to answer these questions more to yourself. We'll be having a group conversation afterwards. But how has illness changed your morning routine? How's it changed your evening routine, your eating habits, your socializing, how you travel? And what are the impacts that that's had? And how do you engage that in as best way as you can? And so with that kind of background, I'd like to start with a definition of spirituality. I've got 3 slides defining that. This is the best worst slide. There's just too much on here. But it comes out of the Royal College of Psychiatric Physicians statement, where Dr. Cook suggests, and this is a mouthful, but they suggest that spirituality is a distinctive, potentially creative and universal dimension of human experience, arising both within the inner, subjective awareness of individuals and within communities, social groups, and traditions. It might be experienced as a relationship with that which is intimately inner, immanent, and personal within the self and others, or as a relationship with that which is wholly other, transcendent, and beyond the self. It is experienced as being of fundamental and ultimate importance, and is thus concerned with matters of meaning and purpose, truth and values. That's a lot, But Christina Puchalski, a psychiatric nurse in the States, made it a little more succinct. And so her phrasing is that spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way we experience our connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to whatever we think of as significant or sacred. Boiled down still further, it's these things. So how do you make connection? How do you make meaning? What's purpose for you? What are your values? And what's your relationship between growth and limits? Because both of those fit into how we engage the world, and in some ways how we make meaning or connect. It sort of ripples up through the other categories. So with those definitions of spirituality, there's lots and lots of room. You might have noticed there's no recourse to a particular tradition or how we do it, because human beings over the course of history have done it in many, many different ways. And a lot of those ways can be very life-giving and serve the individual. But like all things in the human sphere, if there's a bad way to engage something, sometimes we'll find a way to do that too. So how do we make sure that we're using these ideas in ways that are growthful, that enhance human connection and human thriving? And that brings us to spiritual distress. If spirituality is hard to define, then spiritual distress can be even more tricky. I like this map here of if you imagine the line going back and forth, that's your timeline, and how complicated life is, that's your up and down line. And so, most days we're humming along, and our capacity to make sense of the world, our connections in the world, all the stuff that dotted line represents, which is integrated spirituality, is higher than our life experience. So when I got up this morning, there were no huge surprises. I made it to work in one piece. There was no existential crisis at the crossroads. Everything was humming along, and it was fairly reasonable. And as we grow, both of those get filled with experience, both our life experience and our capacity to explain our life experience. But once in a while, our life experience sort of jags up above our capacity to make meaning. It jumps up above our capacity to make sense. And that can be all sorts of things, right? That could be a car accident. That could be discovering you have a new illness. That could be a divorce. That could be retiring. It could be any number of things, where anything that has that big sort of, this might not be a swearing environment, but that big WTF moment that you're like, what is this? What's going on here? And there's a bit of ambivalence around how we make sense of things. Grieving can be a huge spot where our life experience jumps up over our capacity to make sense of it. And we respond in a whole bunch of ways that at first glance might seem irrational. That whole anger, bargaining, all that stuff that Kubler-Ross mentioned in relationship to grieving is true in any kind of frustration or relationship to loss. When something changes in a way that's hard to wrap our heads around, or hard to navigate our life through. And so one version of the definition of spiritual distress is that spiritual distress emphasizes one's impaired ability to integrate meaning, purpose, and values in the setting of a stressor. So if we think of if somebody else's pet dies, our capacity to make meaning isn't impaired, and we're usually, like, we can understand that it's sad, and we're sad for our friend, and we might be sad for their pet and all of that sort of thing. But when one of our own does, it's harder. It's like way harder. So our capacity to make meaning is what's taken a hit, as well as the loss. And that can take some time. And that's why somebody else's grief isn't nearly as agonizing as our own. Not because we're heartless, not because we lack empathy, but our meaning-making systems are still fully online, where in the face of a huge loss, they might not be. And we're gonna touch on that again in a minute. So if we're going along and our capacity to make meaning exceeds the meaning that we need, we're good to go. Otherwise, in that lozenge there, that's spiritual distress. Another way to describe that doesn't highlight our difficulty is when the story you tell yourself about yourself is no longer sufficient. Now, getting a new story can be hard, or enhancing the old one, enriching the old one can be hard. And a lot of this you'll see just as a regular part of the life cycle, right? Like if we look at even just the ideas around the divine, right? Even in the same tradition, the God of a 70-year-old and the God of a 7-year-old should probably be different. They should have a different nuance in their understanding, and there's age appropriate ways for that. And that might be true of anything else in life: love, death, change. How do we navigate those things? And so we're constantly being invited to tell a richer story, so that the story we tell ourselves about ourselves is sufficient. And if on a good day, the ask is just little asks, right? And so it stays within our threshold of tolerance, and we grow as a person, and our capacity grows, and all of that is good. It's just when we get to that difficult moment where we're asked more than we can bear in a given stressor that we now have trouble making sense. And that can result in gaps in connection, gaps in meaning, both personal, my little story, and existential, the story I say about the world. Gaps in purpose, gaps in values expression, and how we experience growth and limits. And so if for example, I have the belief that, what would be a good one? That life is fair and people are paying attention. And then I get onto the highway and somebody dekes out in front of me and takes the spot that should have been mine. And now it's all road rage, and I'm pounding on the steering wheel. That outburst might be underlying rage issues, but it might also be that my capacity to make sense of that with my old story doesn't work anymore. So I can either stick with the old story and die mad about it, or and some people choose that, especially in driving. There's it's almost a whole lifestyle. But then there are other folks who will, maybe I need to understand other drivers in a different way. And so your theory changes, your capacity to make meaning changes, and it doesn't make the drivers any better, but you're able to have a calmer relationship with the highway, right? Which for some of us can be a goal, and for some of us it may not be. So that goes down to values. If we get a real energized feeling about some of those traffic incidents, and they get us all revved up to go to work, well, then who am I to say that that's a bad way to travel? It's not how I would want to travel, but to each their own, right? So the two pieces I really want to highlight are spiritual distress emphasizes one's impaired ability to integrate meaning, purpose, and values in the setting of a stressor, and the less fraught when the story you tell yourself about yourself is no longer sufficient. So when we experience this kind of distress, it can take a lot of different forms. The words in the sound or in the bubble are the same as the ones along the side. I just wanted to pop them out so that they'd be easier to read. These can be some of the ways that we name spiritual distress, because spiritual distress can be a pretty abstract category. So instead, we can talk about feelings of isolation, alienation, loneliness, stuckness, despair, regret, grief, sorrow, sadness, anger, frustration, fear, guilt, shame, that sense of not enoughness or too muchness, being tired, feeling limits, feeling unattractive, our sense of worth, our sense of self. Those pieces can all be impacted by a variety of things, and all of them come with a deep emotional component. That's one of the things when we talk about meaning making and purpose, we might imagine that we're way up in our heads, but it's something that lives sort of throughout our entire systems. So I went out and I was looking for something that talked about spiritual distress in the context of inflammatory bowel disorder for both the people who have it and for their caregivers. And so I found this study that, well, I didn't find this study. I found this title, that there was a grant that has been granted. And it's a European cross-sectional nursing study, but it was just started this year. So this is being funded right now, and I have no data from it because it's just too new. So maybe in a year, this will be available, and it might be a way of adding specific words and concerns around the stuff that looks like this. Until then, we each have to sort of find our own way through. And I'm sure even after the study is done, they'll still be like, well, how much do I resemble the study or not? And we'll see. So we've looked at spirituality, both the $10 and $2 definitions of it. We've looked at spiritual distress, and some of the spiritual distress might come in other forms. I was just sort of spitballing here, but the idea of self-worth, or if we've got some things wrapped up around ideas of purity or cleanliness or injustice or fairness, or we might just be sad or angry or feeling distant from whether it's the divine, the world, the people that are close to us. And sometimes spiritual distress in relation to any condition can just be that sort of inner peace is more elusive. It's hard to get to. I know that years ago I was doing some sort of personal work around other things, and everyone's like, oh, be grateful, and I had plenty to be grateful for, and I was doing my little gratitude lists. But if I was perfectly honest, way up front, in the front of my heart or the front of my head, I wasn't feeling it. I didn't have access to those emotions at that time. I still did my little list, and whatever. I still worked on it, and it took time, and there were other things that needed to be put in place so that I could recontextualize the things that were happening to me, for me, with me. There's some preposition there in that part of my life, but I didn't have access to gratitude, where before and after that I did, right? And so discovering what you do and don't have access to, and where is it just a good idea just to exercise the possibility of something until it shows up. And inner peace can be like that. Gratitude can be like that. On the other hand, some of those feisty emotions can also help us move through hard times. So yeah. So what do we do with that? Again, spirituality, spiritual distress. So what? This is sort of a model I put together, an impossible model that I don't actually live up to. But what does spiritual health look like, sort of from top to bottom, the whole shebang? And it would involve a certain set of body basics, a certain set of mental basics, emotional basics, moral, ethical basics, and relational basics. And a lot of these are empty categories. Like, what values are important to me and what values are important to another person don't always line up, or they might be the similar ones, but they stack in different ways. Right? There are folks who would, just to get some easy abstract ones, honesty and kindness. There are people who will put honesty before kindness. There are people who will put kindness before honesty. And there are people who will look at their relationship and go, my relationship with my brother is strong enough to put honesty before kindness, and I can tell him that that's a terrible haircut. Or if I didn't think that was possible, I might stack them the other way. So values are also these things that they kind of get shuffled by circumstances. And there are times where shuffling them makes sense, and privileging one over the other makes sense for a variety of reasons. But then if we shuffle them too much, they might not be in the right order anymore. They might not make sense. So that's just what matters to us. And values include not only sort of virtue values, but values like the things that we like or the things that we want. So your favorite sport or your favorite hobby, the people in your life, the pets in your life, those would all count in that category. And they might be different. Well, they will be different for different people. The relationship that we have with work might be different. So in each of these categories, we want to develop and maintain a general lifestyle and specific practices that cultivate these areas in ways that are appropriate to your authentic self. And nobody else can tell you what exactly that means. And that's why spiritual care exists. That's why therapy exists, because our answers won't be the same. And the answers that other people give us aren't always useful, right? Like even if I was right, if I show up and I give you a little piece of wisdom and it sort of sits on the top of your head like a hat, right? But if I ask the right question, that has to come up through your whole system and then you own it. So my job is not to be right. My job is to ask good questions. Or sometimes I say my job is to be wrong in a good way so that it evokes the right things out of the person I'm speaking with. But with all of these things, where do we find that connection, meaning, purpose, values? And there are different ways for different people to do it at different ages and stages of life. So there's not one tidy answer. Going back to distress, again, if spiritual distress is when the story you tell yourself about yourself is no longer sufficient and your capacity to make that meaning a purpose is impaired in the face of a stressor, then how do we engage that? There are real and valid challenges to acting, thinking, feeling, and engaging in those holistic ideals from the previous slide. If this was an easy list, we could just send out the list on a brochure and I wouldn't need to talk about it. Instead, we have these real world challenges that come with being human beings in the world. And so what I want to emphasize is that spiritual distress is normal. Everyone will get it at some point. There'll be a place where your capacity to engage the world will exceed what the world is throwing at you. That is part of the human condition. And it's not an indictment of your character. It's not one of these things that, grandma prayed better than I do, and now she has a better way of making meaning, but I don't because I'm a terrible human being. Like it's not that. It's not an indictment of your character. So be honest, right? Start where you're at. Like, when I went through that period where gratitude was beyond me. I mean, rationally, I knew that gratitude was, I had things to be grateful for, but I had to start with exactly where I was. Be kind. It's about progress, not perfection. And I don't think perfection even exists in this category, because if I did manage to get it just right, it would be under a very particular circumstances, and the world keeps moving. So even if I was perfect a moment ago, by the time I wake up the next day, things are in motion, and so it's always a dance of returning to what works, and what works might change over time. Be willing to name the barriers. If depression is getting in my way, if my changes in physical capacity are creating all sorts of feelings, some things can be changed and some things cannot be changed, and then we have to change our relationship with them. But we need to be allowed to name the barriers. Like what makes things hard. If you can name them, it gets easier. And of course, no one can do it for you, but you don't need to do it alone. This is something that support groups like this can help with. It's something that other community groups can help with in a variety of ways. And just finding your people, figuring out how to have that conversation in a good way is really important. And so this is, because back here I talked about, where is it? Self-compassion. Often we can be really nice to other people, road rage example aside, but being nice to ourselves can be really challenging. We can be really judgmental to ourselves. And so I came across this approach just the other day. This is not mine, but the idea that when we judge ourselves, when we're really hard on ourselves for not being this way or not being that way, not meeting real or imaginary goals, there's always 100 reasons to be really hard on ourselves in a way that is not useful or kind. And just saying, well, that's not useful or kind, now you're feeling guilty about treating yourself badly, and it just layers up, right? Like we can feel bad about treating ourselves badly. Not useful. And so I saw this little picture here, and it was in response to a write-up that I saw. I don't even remember where I saw it, but self-compassion was likened to you wake up one morning and open the door, and there's a little wet cat in front of the door. And so you take it in, you dry it off. It's now your cat. You go out and buy litter and food and all the things. Um, and it doesn't have to be the smartest cat in the world for you to love your cat. It doesn't have to be the prettiest cat in the world for you to love your cat. It can even be a little bit of a jerk and you still love your cat. So could we treat ourselves with that same kindness? Like just imagine that you're your own cat, or somebody's just dropped you off on your own doorstep, and now how are you going to treat yourself, whether or not you're the whatever the list of things that you treat yourself badly about. How do you treat yourself like that sort of wet, maybe slightly jerk of a cat that still benefits from your attention. And if we can do that for our cats, I'm hoping that we can do that for ourselves as well. I hope that made sense. This is the first time I'm telling the cat story, so it was clearer in my head. And so that's all the material. That's all the material I had for today. And I'm hoping that there's room for a bit of a conversation around that. Feel free to unmute yourself, or we can put questions in. Can you see the chat? So questions in the chat, somebody else can relay them to me, or we can just talk about them out loud, because I gave you sort of the from 500 feet view, but what does this look like, right where you are, right in your own shoes? Any questions, comments, concerns?
Okay, I guess I'll get started. Thank you for that talk. It was really inspiring to hear that we're not alone out there feeling crappy in the morning. That's how I felt this morning. I'm looking at retirement and I'm thinking I'm still good at what I do. I'm a practicing chiropractor. I've got a number of patients to see today, but I really like to stay home. And, it's been a nice weekend, and why do I have to go out now? So I get there and just gravitate towards the energy of the patients and start to feel better and better as the day goes along. And I'm thinking, what the heck was I worried about? This is what I live for. We still have a 3-day weekend every week. And so, yeah, it's about how the attitude of gratitude, it's the attitude of how you perceive yourself. It's where you think you're going and how you kind of gravitate towards that. And it ended up being a really good day. So for what it's worth, that's what worked for me today, but it didn't start out feeling very good. That line was like this.
Fair. And I think that you're bringing up something that's really important. We don't need to feel good to do the work. We need to do the work to feel good. So whether it's engaging other people or whatever it is that we're up to, we do have to feel a certain amount of good. Like we have to have the capacity to move. But beyond that, like often I'll feel better after a day of work or a day of doing a bit of volunteering, or when we serve. I know when I serve others, it helps me sort of get my head out of my own self-concern and into the world, and that can be really useful. And I do end up feeling a little bit better, and I think that has an increase over time. Like we end up putting coins in that piggy bank over a long haul, and it helps a bit. But yeah, we don't need to start off in the morning feeling like we don't need to feel really good. We need. It's been a long day. I'm just gonna own that. Yeah.
And then how this relates to the disease, and people like myself, I'm very blessed that I don't have symptoms, dealt with what I've got, and I feel good every day, and I don't take medication. But for the ones that have to deal with episodes and they're dealing with chronic pain, which I see a lot in practice, it's not easy. It's a constant struggle to remind yourself of this is the level I have to get to kind of feel better and not get the self-pity routine and go down that rabbit hole. It's tough because pain hurts.
Yeah. And what counts as good enough will be different day to day and from person to person. And so trying to stay kind to ourselves when all of that's going on can be challenging. That's a whole practice in and of itself.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sheldon, you coped for many years. What's going on?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep. Oh, no, now we can't.
How about now?
Perfect.
So I deal with symptoms every day, and I guess I try and do things that distract me. I think the key is either work or distraction. I don't have much work because I'm 99% retired. So distraction is important. You got to have other things to do. And if I didn't, I'm sure I would focus more on the pain, and that wouldn't be good. So distractions are important. Being able to do the distractions are important.
Yeah.
I was helping a neighbor today because her husband's out of the country. She doesn't know what to do. So I was just helping her with certain little winterizing things around the house. And I guess that's important. You need things to do or distractions. Otherwise, you will focus on the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in that list that I had pulled together, that what you pointed to just there was, yes, it's distraction, but it also counts as service. It counts as meaningful engagement. It counts as community. It ticks a whole bunch of those boxes all at the same time. I think that's
Right.
beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, we like to travel too, so that takes up a bit of our time. I like to plan for travel. I like to give others tips on how to travel well. So again, it's all distractions. It's
Keeping busy.
keeping busy.
Yeah. Yeah, busy is good.
And I think I've just managed to, find the right place for ignoring the inconvenient and focusing on other things.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Barb's quiet.
Yeah. Oh, there's a hand with Steph.
Hi, I'm Steph. So I'm currently having a really bad flare right now. I haven't eaten in 8 days. I'm on, like constantly in and out of the hospital. And I know that you mentioned that guilt is a big one. And I know, and like I appreciate that you were trying to be as secular as you can be. I like personally, I do believe in God. Like I'm not super religious, but like I do. So I don't, and I know that like you mentioned guilt. I don't know how to make that guilt go away because I'm like, okay, well, this is like I'm only in my mid-20s. I've been hospitalized like 10 times. Like, what am I doing wrong? Kind of like, why is this my fault?
Yeah, that's worthy of a really deeper conversation. But that feeling of guilt that comes up whenever we cross our own values, right? When the thing we're doing or experiencing is different from what we'd like, what we want it to be. And so sometimes exploring what that is and how that works can help diminish that feeling in a big way. Because we can have like the feeling is always pointing to somebody, something. So the feeling is always legit, but some of my guilt might be a more existential guilt, or it might be related to, there's actually something called inauthentic guilt, which is no less painful, but it means that I'm feeling guilty about something that I actually haven't done. Not something that I've failed to do, but something that it's not even about like, I can't do that. Like if I felt this feeling because it was raining, Like that wouldn't be the right connection. And yet if the feeling is real for me, how do I engage it? How do we sort of slow it down enough and have those conversations around what is and isn't in our power? Because guilt, it can be one of those feelings that reminds me if I'm off the mark, but also if it's sort of misfiring, then it's doing something else. And so it can be good to talk to somebody just around exploring what that means. Right? Does that make sense?
I think so, kind of.
Fair. Yeah, but just noticing that it's there, I think, is really a good start. And then finding out what it's related to can be important because we end up with a lot of different feelings, and they're always telling us something. But what's underneath that isn't always as straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, like trying to kind of find the reason behind it more.
Yeah. And also with that, finding room for again, self-compassion or forgiveness, whether that's forgiving ourselves or the world, or in most traditions, God is usually big enough to receive some of our annoyance as well. Maybe we can be mad at God. However we do it, just finding a way to explore our feelings in a richer way, in a deeper way with the folks that matter to us. And if God's on that list, then there's certainly a conversation to be had.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Any other questions, concerns?
I think what I find is I've had Crohn's for 55 years, and I think I've had so many problems over the years, so many challenges, so many things that have worried me, that have scared me. I think the hardest thing now is how to get outside of my head. My head is so in tuned with all the bad things that have happened that if something happens new that I'm not used to, I have to worry about it all over again. I have to get outside my head if I can, and being more retired than not at this point is really difficult. I've always loved being very busy, and I'm not very busy now. Shelley, you talked about retirement and what that's like. I'm much better off when I'm very busy than when I'm in my head. So I don't really know how to deal with that, especially since COVID has kept us so contained, so confined, so much in our places alone. It's really hard to get out and have fun and just be part of the world. And instead, I'm in my head.
Yeah, that's really, really valid. And I think a lot of people share versions of that. It's so important, especially since COVID. I can't imagine what this would have been like in the absence of the internet. I'm always going on about how being online can actually be a problem and doom scrolling and stuff like that. But it can also be like really, really life-saving to have those conversations with other people. And as you say, to get us out of our head just a little bit. Acts of service can do that as well. And as communities open up again, a lot of the things on that list that I put up, we would find those benefits in traditional faith communities. We would also find most of them in a really good softball team. Not to take away from one or the other, but there are places where just being humans together is really helpful. And so finding ways to do it virtually if we can't do it in person is really good. And as you say, keeping busy, finding ways to engage our mind and our emotions and all of those things in a good way can be an ongoing challenge, especially when isolation is part of the picture. Yeah. Okay, last calls for questions before we move on to the next stage of, I'm not clear on what the next stage is, but when I'm done this stage.
I just wanted to comment, Brian, that I really appreciated, I guess, the layout that you gave us in terms of, feeling that disconnect sometimes between your life experiences and capacity to understand yourself and the world around you. And I think that, I'm in a pretty good health space right now, but I've had IBD and other chronic illnesses related to it for many decades. And I think that was a really, really succinct summary of how you put it, because I've had those moments myself where I've had that disconnect and I've thought, I can't really figure out why this is happening to me. I feel really powerless. I feel that I have no agency, that things are just happening to me and I have no control over what's happening or for how long or how to get out of it. Sorry, here's my little cat.
There we go.
My good reminder for self-compassion. Yeah, so it's I guess it's good to be mindful of those things, and your suggestion for acts of service and things like that. I found that even when I feel like I have no control over my life, that's been something that has maybe given me that sense of purpose, or at least a bit of control over how I can maybe contribute to or help other people. So it's really, also a huge benefit to me too. So
Wise words. Thank you for sharing.
is there anyone else that has a question or a comment? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Brian. I think it was a really meaningful talk, and it sounds like it connected with people in a lot of different ways. Everybody, I think, shared a bit of a different experience.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Okay, we're good? Yeah. Brenda will come and see us off.
Hi, folks. I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight and wish you all very happy holidays. We will resume the end of January on a virtual only meeting. Dr. Tay Hart will be presenting. So she is a clinical psychologist. I don't have a topic just yet because she's on sabbatical, but it will be the last Monday in January. I believe it's January 30th. Whatever the last Monday is, there you go. So 2025, I haven't got that new calendar out yet. But I want to thank Brian for spending his evening with us, and thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you in the new year. Okay, take care. All the best. Bye, guys.